Hello and welcome to the President's Podcast right here on the record with the Ohio Senate. The views the news excludes. I'm John Fortney, the Director of Communication with the Senate Republican Caucus, the Majority Caucus in the Ohio Senate. Welcome to a brand new year. Welcome to the 136th General Assembly, and welcome to new Senate President, the new President of the Ohio Senate, Rob McColley. Welcome back to the program. You're no stranger to the podcast, but now you are the President of the Ohio Senate. Congratulations.
Thank you. Now we're not in somebody else's office. So
Exactly. You are in the President's office, absolutely. And opening day was Monday, and snowy day in Columbus and all through southern Ohio, but constitutionally, the state says you can't take a snow day on the start of the 136th GA. It's right there in the Constitution, the first Monday of January, with the new swearing in of the new General Assembly.
Yeah, it was obviously some of our friends from Southern Ohio in particular had to brave the elements to get up, thankfully, without issue. And I think attendance was impacted a little bit from some of the guests, but nevertheless, it was a great day that went off pretty well.
Yeah, so you're the new Senate President. You also were able to present the outgoing Senate President, Matt Huffman, with a Ohio flag that flew over the state capitol. By the way, we have the day-in photos from opening day of the 136th GA. On our social media, go to our Facebook page. It's just at Ohio Senate GOP, Ohio Senate GOP. And you can always go to On the Record as well, ohiosenate.gov/news. We're the first drop down on the record. That must have been a special moment, though, to be able to present Matt Huffman the Ohio flag. You're the new Senate President, and then he walked across the rotunda to become the Speaker of the House.
Yeah, it's one of the things that I really particularly enjoy about the legislature, and particularly enjoy about the entire institution of the Ohio General Assembly, are the various traditions that we have, and I think it's important to keep those traditions going. And one of them is, at least during my time in the legislature, is at the conclusion of a leader's term in the Senate. That Senate president is presented with the state flag that flew over the Capitol during the days that president was in session and leading the chamber. And I think it's important and probably a nice family heirloom or something that they'll be able to pass down, recognizing their service and their time as the head of the chamber.
You have a great family, a beautiful family. You have twin boys, and you also have a daughter, and great photos as well of the family as you were also taking the oath of office. Tell us a little bit about yourself, your family, and growing up. You're born and raised in Napoleon.
Yeah, born and raised in Napoleon, and live there now, actually, and I'm very fortunate to represent the town that I grew up in. My wife, Denise, was able to come down. I was able to have my mother and father-in-law join us, and two of my nieces from my wife's side. And then my parents, I was very fortunate to have them there. My mom actually swore me in, which was a nice privilege to be able to have. She's a retired judge from Henry County. And then, of course, my children and my brother and his children as well were able to join us. So it was a great day for all of us. I was presented with a nice gift.
Yeah, we can
actually,
show that.
You want
we can
to hand
show
that to me? I was presented with a nice gift by the great folks here in the Senate of a gavel that was actually made by the great students up at Vantage Career Center in Van Wert County in my district. And they were nice enough to make this gavel. And actually, if you zoom in on it, which I believe you are right now, you can see that it has the signatures of my children, and that were collected and were laser inscribed then on the gavel. I believe right here you have Anna right there, my daughter. You have Mike in the middle, one of my twin boys, and then you have Matt over here. This was a gift that meant an awful lot to me, and so I will not only use these, but cherish them as well.
It's always nice to have a reminder of who your family is, because you spend a lot of time in Columbus. It's not like you're coming from one or two counties away. You're coming from the corner of Northwest Ohio, and you spend a lot of time down here, and you'll spend a lot of time away from your family. And there's things that every lawmaker will say, oh, I missed this game or I missed that. So it's good to have a reminder right there on the gavel.
Yeah, and that's something we don't really talk about all that much as legislators, and it's probably more common in the House than it is in the Senate, just because of the age of the legislators in both chambers, generally speaking. But there are a lot of people down here who are serving who have young kids, and I personally got elected. My daughter, my oldest child, was born a month and a half after I got elected to the House. And we've had obviously our other two children after that, and so my kids know no different, and so maybe that's a benefit for them, I suppose. But they're the ones who have to deal with the interruptions to life and their schedules and everything, and sometimes me not being able to attend some of their events because I'm down here in Columbus, and obviously our spouses are in the same boat. So my wife has been very supportive of me being down here. My kids have been very supportive. So in many ways, Monday was a celebration of them as well. So, and I know they appreciated everything that went on.
Well, it's also a great point to make because, I think sometimes that members of any political body, whether it's the Ohio General Assembly, the Ohio Senate, or even Congress, people think, oh, they're so insulated and they're out of touch, but you're a family man. You have young children. And so you think about those things when it comes to crafting public policy along with your colleagues.
Yeah, and that's the end goal, is ultimately, it sounds cliche, but we want to make Ohio a better place to live, work, and raise a family. But it's all true. And I think, obviously, when you have your own family that you're hoping will one day decide to stay in Ohio and raise their family, obviously, when you're crafting policy, you want to not only craft policy that's going to make a difference today, but policies that will hopefully pay dividends for years to come. And, I'll give a shout out to Governor DeWine. He always likes to reference the planting of trees by his grandfather as kind of a way to invest in the future and pay it forward. That, his grandfather, when he would plant trees on his property, would say, I'm never going to see these trees grow to maturity, but future generations will, and they'll be able to enjoy them. And so it's in some ways it's the same way we should look at public policy, in that it's the impact of many public policies. Very few of them will you notice an immediate impact. Many of them will take years for you to notice an impact. But when we look at public policy, we shouldn't just be looking for the policies that are going to have an immediate impact. We should be looking at policies that, maybe, 5, 10, 15 years from now, this policy is really going to be able to make a difference, and one that we're going to look back on and say, I'm glad that the people who were making those decisions had that type of foresight.
As we talk about public policy, obviously it's a bicameral Ohio General Assembly. Nebraska is the only one that has a unicameral General Assembly. They call it the Senate there. Here in the Senate, and of course the outgoing, as we referenced, Senate President is now the Speaker of the House, Matt Huffman. What's your expectations as far as passing the transportation budget, the operating budget, significant pieces of legislation that really set the standard for tax policy to education spending? What do you think the relationship will be, or what will be the significant change maybe in this General Assembly that we haven't seen in other General Assemblies over the last, say, 6 or 8 years?
Well, I think I know Matt Huffman and I have had a very good working relationship during our time serving together in the General Assembly. Obviously, I was very privileged to be on his leadership team for the 4 years that he served as president. Was very fortunate to carry a lot of big issues during that time frame and work with him and get to know his style. And I believe he probably knows my style of doing things as well. We know each other well enough that we can be direct and open communicators with each other without feeling like one of the other ones is going to use it against us, for laying our cards on the table. And so I think it will be a much more cooperative General Assembly. It'll be one that we're going to be able to air our issues out. People might not see that there will be a lot of compromise behind the scenes because, of course, our chamber isn't always going to be in lockstep with their chamber, and it's not always what Matt Huffman and Rob McColley want. It's what the entire Senate wants and what the entire House wants. But we'll be able to talk through that, I think, pretty effectively and it'll lead to a much more efficient and productive legislature.
Well, good faith negotiations are called good faith negotiations, and that's how you get results.
Yes.
Instead of trying to undermine one another. And people have asked me before, well, you're all Republicans, you're all in the majority. What about your members? Don't you always agree? And my reply is, well, at your Thanksgiving family meal, does everybody agree there? Well, no. I mean, family members disagree, husbands and wives disagree, kids disagree, and it's all about having a cordial disagreement and trying to resolve your issues.
Yes.
Let's talk a little bit about the transportation budget is coming up. That always has people a little bit rattled about, are they going to be raising gas taxes? Are they going to be raising taxes? And that's always a big deal. Obviously, the state needs funding to keep the highway projects moving, keep things paved and moving smoothly. What's the big lift, do you think, on the transportation budget before we get to the operating budget?
Well, I think going into the transportation budget, obviously, for those who are unaware, every time you buy a gallon of gas, you're paying so many cents of the cost of that gallon of gas goes to the state and the federal government to pay for state and federal gas taxes that then get returned to pay for roads and bridges here in the state of Ohio. And in the federal government's case, they take it and then they return it back to us in some form or fashion. And so I'm not sure that there will be many controversial issues in this upcoming transportation budget. I know there was a gas tax increase probably 4 or 6 years ago. I think it was 6 years ago. There was a gas tax increase, one that obviously garnered an awful lot of attention. I don't anticipate there will be another effort to raise the gas tax. That was a pretty significant increase. 6
People
years
noticed
ago.
that. People definitely noticed that.
Yeah.
It was a big fight. I remember when the governor rolled that out.
Now, I think there might be some people who will talk about it because inflation has hit everything, including the price of construction. But nevertheless, I don't believe that will be part of the conversation. I think what we might look into is, are there efficiency measures potentially that could be implemented that could be cost cutting on our end? And maybe that's a way that we free up some more dollars to be put into the actual construction of our roads and bridges in the state of Ohio.
The 2-year operating budget is coming up, as we've said on this program multiple times over the last 10 years, at least when I started here. There were 9 state income tax brackets. Now there are only 2. Do you think that there will be discussion regarding, do we get to a flat tax? Do we get to one bracket? Do we stay where we are? I mean, how big of a discussion do you think that will be?
I know in our chamber it will be a very big discussion. Our caucus is very much tax reform minded. Our caucus is very much in favor of lowering Ohioans' tax burden. And the income tax is something that virtually every Ohioan has to pay. And you are right. We've been on this march for a long time. It's hard to just simply take a broad brush and slash it all the way to the bone. But it's been years of change and incremental reductions and elimination of brackets that have gotten us where we are. When I came into the legislature, and I came from economic development prior to coming here, there were many cases where we would lose economic development projects because our tax burden was too high in the state of Ohio. And we simply don't hear that as much anymore. And it's not that the tax burden at the local level has changed all that much. It's the tax burden at the state level that has dramatically reduced for Ohioans and for businesses that is leading Ohio to be a better business climate than what it had been in the past. And so I expect that we will want to continue that conversation. And if we can get down to one income tax bracket, AKA a flat tax, I do think that would be something that we should pursue.
Low tax on the state level, much higher taxes on the local level. There was the recent release or publishing of the Joint Committee on Property Tax Reform. It's been a big issue now for at least the last 6 months, when several counties went through their valuation process and there were big jumps in property tax bills. And then we had the Select Committee on Affordable Housing that did hearings across the state. And one of the things that we heard, especially from retired individuals, a retired teacher I can remember at the hearing in Cleveland talked about, well, I've owned my house. my husband died. Owned my house now for 30 years, but I'm afraid I won't be able to pay the property taxes, and I don't want to lose my house. I think that's a reasonable position to take if you're retired and on a fixed income. What's your overall message about what you think the Senate will be taking a look at regarding the valuation process in the state?
So the way I've looked at property taxes is over the time that I've been in the legislature, it seems like these issues pop up and we try to deal with these issues in a vacuum, where we'll open up the hood and we'll tinker with something. We'll put a Band-Aid on the formula for calculating property taxes, and then we'll close the hood and see if it runs. Unfortunately, the whole engine might need a look at this point. I personally believe that, obviously, there's certain inflationary factors that people should expect to have to deal with. But if you're a homeowner who owns your home, has owned your home for quite some time, you haven't made any significant changes to your home or modifications, you haven't made any significant renovations or additions to your home that would have led to a valuation increase aside from maybe a modest inflation adjustment, then you should have a little bit more predictability in the formula to deal with the potential tax increases as a result of revaluation. Some people in the state of Ohio were seeing 30 or 40% increases as a result of those changes, outpacing inflation. Obviously, a lot of it's based on what the home market is and what homes are selling for. But if you haven't done anything to your home, then that you shouldn't have to deal with that type of increase that quickly. So that's my own personal opinion. I speak for one of one at this point. I know there are 32 other senators who all probably have their own viewpoint as to how we could deal with this. But there needs to be, at the end of the day, if I could sum it up, there needs to be way more predictability in the way that we deal with property taxes.
And this is one thing that local taxpayers have a significant say in. Ask your school board, your local school board, why they need another levy on top of a renewal. Ask your local library about their levy. Ask the, transportation system about their levy. It seems like levy after levy after levy, and it does add up to your property tax bill climbing.
And this is where when people look at Ohio from a tax standpoint, we talked earlier about how the state's tax burden is not that great relative to states around the country. We're in a pretty good spot as far as what you actually have to pay directly to the state of Ohio. As it concerns the local tax burden and the pancaking of various taxes on taxpayers at the local level, that's where we begin to slip in our competitiveness relative to other states. Ohio has way more political subdivisions than most states, and I think even insofar as even school districts, we have way more school districts than most states around us. Now, that's not all bad, because in many of these communities, these school districts have decided, look, we're willing to vote for a levy because having our own school as opposed to being annexed into a neighboring district is important to us, and I can't blame them for that. But we have way more local political subdivisions than any other state, and in many cases, many of them are all getting a piece of the pie from local taxpayers, and that's something that Ohioans, at the very least, should be aware of when they evaluate what their tax burden is.
Are we in year 4 or 5 of the Fair School Funding Plan that was passed, I think, 3 General Assemblies ago? Because we continue to hear, one, well, Ohio's unconstitutional school funding system, which is absolutely false. The school funding system has been constitutional with the first budget, starting with after the Ohio Supreme Court released the case. And secondly, this whole idea of schools not having enough money, when you look at some of the 5-year forecasts through the Department of Education and Workforce website, which you can go click on 5-year forecast, and you can see what the forecast is on some of these districts where, for example, the city of Columbus is now forecasting more than $300 million cash carryovers. I mean, what's your answer about, do schools have enough money?
Well, I think Ohioans need to be aware of the investments we have made. And if you listen to a lot of the rhetoric from many school districts across the state of Ohio, they'll talk to you like they've been flat funded for decades. And that is simply false. Their funding, I believe Auditor Faber came out with a report that basically says over the last 20 years, the funding that we provided to school districts after you take out inflation has gone up 30% relative to what it was 20 years ago or so. And I could be off on a little bit on my numbers, but that's the general gist of it. When you factor in inflation, or when you allow inflation to be considered as part of the number, it is remarkably significant, the amount of money that we have put into school districts. Over $1 billion, I believe, in the last budget increase, not just the number we put in.
That's K through 12 public schools.
Yes, K through 12 public schools. This isn't counting the educational choice voucher money. Doesn't count any of that money. That money is separately funded in its own silo. This is just K-12 public school funding. And so, we've done I believe, a good job at trying to keep up with inflation, exceeding inflation, in fact, and putting a lot of state dollars back into public education. And so Ohioans simply need to be aware of this when they're evaluating decisions as to whether they should pass another levy. We have information available on the state's websites that are very open and transparent to any Ohioan to be able to see how well funded your district is relative to others. Now, I will also say there are districts, and I even have some in my district, that due to some of the formula issues, they get counted as wealthier than they actually are. And, in some cases, they don't get as much funding as they should for the type of district they are. And so it's not a perfect formula. I'm freely willing to admit that. But on the whole, education funding from a macro standpoint, there are not issues with it. And when you're carrying over, in some case, some of these districts, well over 70% of what their annual expense outlays are, in that they carry over that year to year, that's a lot of money to carry over to say that you're having to pinch pennies in many ways.
The state also funding the Ed Choice Scholarship Program on a sliding income scale, making it available to any Ohio family to consider. That's been an overwhelming success. And you hear the people against the program, like the Coalition for Equity and Adequacy in School Funding and all the marble rolling that goes on and lawsuits, and talk about, that funding should go to public schools. Well, why are you making parents the enemy then? Don't parents who are also taxpayers, shouldn't they have a say about where their kids can go? And it actually saves the state money, because if the average per pupil spending statewide is, I think, $14,200, somewhere around that, maybe $14,216. The Ed Choice Scholarship, K through 8 scholarship, full scholarship is $6,100. It's $8,400 for K through 12. That's the full scholarship. Not everybody gets that based on the sliding income scale. Do you think that this is an important program for parents?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I've said this a number of times. We recently passed the Parents' Bill of Rights in the last General Assembly, allowing parents to have a better idea of what is going on with their child in the school buildings. I will never apologize, nor should any of us ever apologize for giving parents a greater say in the education of their children. And for anybody to oppose that, for me, simply, you will have no audience with me at the end of the day, because it is simply absurd to say that parents should not have a say in this. And I even apply that to the educational choice program, is because at the end of the day, we are giving children and parents the opportunity to choose the best educational option for them, not for the public school district, not for some state policy or whatever the case may be. It is the best education option for them. And at the end of the day, that is, everybody's saying, you need to make policy that's in the best interest of the people. Well, how can there be a better education policy that's in the best interest of the people to be able to say, no matter what your income is, we're going to find a way to be able to fund your educational choice. And if you have a parochial school or a private school nearby that you want to send your kids, and you feel strongly that that's the best option for you and your family, then by God, we're going to allow you to afford it, even if previously you could not afford it. And I don't think there's a more pro-family, pro-parent, pro-children policy that we can implement than that.
Well said. Well said. One of the big lifts coming up as well later in the year will be the redraw or new draw of the state's congressional districts, the congressional map. Under Article 19, that was passed by more than 75% of the voters in 2018. So this is a process that starts in the General Assembly, and we will be using the same census data that we have. There won't be any new numbers, correct?
That is correct. We will be using the census data from the previous decennial census.
And also I've seen some, and we'll talk about one editorial here momentarily, but I've also seen the narrative coming from the left about Ohio's unconstitutional congressional map. That's totally false as well, completely constitutional, because the U.S. Supreme Court, and correct me if I'm wrong, you're a lawyer, but the U.S. Supreme Court vacated the Ohio Supreme Court, as I like to call it, the O'Connor 4-3 majority, vacated the ruling, which meant that, well, you should reconsider this because this map is constitutional.
So the push that the maps that we have right now are unconstitutional is misleading at best, an outright lie potentially at worst, because you're absolutely right. The Constitution of the United States and previous Supreme Court precedent in the state says that until an act of the Redistricting Commission or the legislature is deemed unconstitutional, it is inherently constitutional, okay? And so you take a step beyond that. So the Supreme Court did rule that the maps at one point were unconstitutional. The United States Supreme Court came down and said, no, your ruling is flawed, in light of Moore v. Harper, where it basically says the courts can't meddle past the bounds of the Constitution. And evidently, the United States Supreme Court felt that the Ohio Supreme Court, under the leadership of Chief Justice O'Connor, meddled beyond the bounds of our constitutional amendment that's in place right now, and actually granted review of the Ohio Supreme Court decisions. And you are correct, vacated the previous decisions, thereby vacating all the rulings that declared that the maps were unconstitutional. Therefore, the maps are now constitutional until and unless ruled otherwise. And the plaintiffs, rather the petitioners in that case, had an opportunity to go back to the court and convince them, in light of the guidance from the United States Supreme Court and Moore v. Harper, that the maps are still unconstitutional. However, the petitioners dismissed their case after that Supreme Court certiorari grant of jurisdiction came down. That alone should tell you right there that they were more interested in the soundbite of being able to say that these were unconstitutional rather than going back to the Ohio Supreme Court and probably getting the inevitable result thrown back in their face that, no, these maps now should be deemed constitutional once and for all. So that's where we stand right now. So people should be wary of much of the rhetoric that's being thrown around regarding some of these things. And I'm sure we will cover redistricting at length when the time comes. But it's simply a departure from the truth to say that these maps are currently deemed unconstitutional.
It was interesting, too, after the sweeping defeat of State Issue 1, where former President Huffman said on his last podcast that he thought the spending from the Citizens Not Politicians campaign, or as I like to call them, the Political Outcomes Over People campaign, was going to be somewhere around $43 million, which was remarkable, outspent the opposition campaign 5 times. And if you go to On the Record, go to ohiosenate.gov, go over to News, On the Record is the first drop down, you'll see a little column here that I wrote responding to an editorial that was published in the Columbus Dispatch and the Dispatch papers, the Gannett papers, by the former Chief Justice Maureen O'Connor. And my little tombstone thumbnail right here says political outcomes over people. Here lies gerrymandering, $40 million worth of lies buried beneath. Issue 1, special interest, coastal dark money, D.C. swamp monsters. And I say former Chief Justice of the Ohio Supreme Court, Maureen O'Connor, penned an editorial for the Dispatch whining that the defeat of Issue 1, the secretly funded $40 million out-of-state driven dark money campaign, was, quote, reaffirmation by the voters that they hate gerrymandering, which I thought that was a remarkable misinterpretation. I say, no, the voters rejected the fact that 99.7% of this $40 million campaign was financed outside of Ohio, amounting to nothing more than a progressive power grab by coastal and D.C. elites who hired a former Chief Justice whose redistricting rulings were scorned by 2 federal courts, including the U.S. Supreme Court, to be the face of their attempt to disenfranchise millions of Ohio voters with an unelected and unaccountable panel of, you guessed it, retired politicians just like her. And then one of the most audacious things that she said, she accused the Secretary of State, Frank LaRose, and one of our members, Senator Teresa Gavarone, of colluding with the opposition campaign. What's your thoughts about that?
Well, I read the op-ed that former Chief Justice O'Connor placed in the Dispatch. The great gaping hole in it is that, yeah, Ohioans don't like gerrymandering. I would agree with that, but she fails to acknowledge that the Issue 1 campaign would have installed gerrymandering into our Constitution. We've covered that extensively. She evidently hasn't come to grips with that, even though I think anybody who's being objective and reading the language realizes it would have led to an unaccountable gerrymandering mechanism. And it's worth pointing out that language that was approved by the ballot board, Secretary LaRose, Senator Gavarone, both being part of the ballot board, went in front of the Ohio Supreme Court, and the Ohio Supreme Court ruled that the language was actually truthful. And so, she can't decide that she likes Ohio Supreme Court rulings on one day and she hates them on the other day. You have to be intellectually honest. You have to be fair about it. And so that's where we are.
Exactly. You made the point because she's doubling down, I said. She had the audacity to say, quote, nonetheless, a narrow partisan majority of the court upheld the language in a decision that was panned by nearly every commentator and editorial board in the state, to which I had a laugh out loud by that. I said, funny, did she forget about all those narrow 4-3 majority opinions led by her and her liberal flunkies on the court, the very same 4-3 opinions that were panned by the federal benches? And oh, by the way, the voters also rejected every editorial board in the state.
They did.
And they elected Republicans to the Ohio Supreme Court, which was a stinging rebuke of Ohio voters that, listen, we like the process that we passed for the General Assembly maps and the congressional maps by 70 and 75% of the vote. And now we're sending a message to you that we reject your gerrymandering narrative by electing Republicans to the court.
Well, and I think it was a big indication that Ohioans thankfully did their homework. Thankfully, there were a lot of people who were willing to have the conversations with their friends and neighbors and family and basically point out that, look, this amendment, this proposed amendment, is not what it portrays itself to be. And Ohioans went, and I had many people come up to me and say, look, we don't like gerrymandering. We may not even like the current system, but what they're proposing in Issue 1 would be far worse, and it would, in essence, in many ways, take away some of the protections and accountability that are built into our current system.
And as we move into the actual redraw of the congressional map, good faith negotiations go a long way to getting to yes and getting to something that is compact and constitutional regarding districts.
And we saw that in 2023 in the most recent state legislative maps where we had a bipartisan unanimous agreement.
One thing before I leave that topic, one thing I would like to see is somebody come out there and say how much the former Chief Justice was paid to be the face of the campaign. I think that's a reasonable question, but I have yet to see a corporate media reporter ask that question of her or that campaign. Final thought, back to your district. You've got a lot of small businesses to be proud of, including a popular candy company that I can remember growing up, seeing them at every barber shop. You have them in your office, Dum Dum lollipops made by?
It's Spangler Candy Company in Bryan, Ohio.
And as we get ready for the NFL playoffs, obviously the college football playoffs as well happening right now, but Wilson footballs are made in your district as well.
That is absolutely correct. Every single football you see used in an NFL game is made in the Wilson Football Factory in Ada, Ohio, in Hardin County.
Ohio Senate President Rob McColley, congratulations. Welcome. We look forward to more President's podcasts through the 136 GA with you. Thanks for your time today.
Yep. Thank you, John.
Thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you soon.